Here's a not so fun fact. 70% of the greenhouse gas pollution from 1988 onward is linked to just 100 corporations, yet you're the one pressured to spend more to offset your carbon. And if you did make the decision to purchase offsets, new research shows so far, 94% of carbon offsets have had zero impact on carbon sequestration. There's a cycle of our leaders in corporations loudly setting large climate targets because they are popular with the vast majority of people, then quietly shredding responsibility while we watch ourselves lose track of climate progress. Eventually, new goals will be made with less and less time to actually prevent the climate crisis. This systematic greenwashing is exhausting. It causes climate action to feel like it's a performative act and disconnects people from actual progress. This is a critical time in building a carbon zero future. The US has a goal to reach net zero emissions by 2050 and to cut 40% by 2030. But on the flip side, the US had record high carbon pollution in 2023, and there's a large probability that anti-climate politicians reverse our progress in the years to come. I'm worried that without a shift in how we approach climate action, the progress we've made will be outweighed by the destruction of biodiversity, rising sea levels, increased extreme weather events, and widespread ecosystem collapse. I think the environmentalism climate movement has lost track of connecting to people on a community level, and that's something that needs to be fixed if we want to meet these climate goals. In this episode, we're going to discuss the overarching actions, attitudes, and societal barriers that are, in a sense, greenwashing climate action and numbing people from a genuine connection to environmental issues. Welcome to the Climate Fairplay podcast. This series is a source on how to bridge the gap between environmental action and community impact. My name is Cody Sanford. I'm a trained ecologist, an environmental journalist, and the host of this series. As the first episode, I want to start by explaining the format of the show and who this podcast is intended for. I'll introduce myself in more detail and explain why I'm dedicating my time and energy to environmental communication. Later, I'll be candid about my dismay with the current state of environmentalism and address the attitude shift that I think is most critical in connecting climate progress to people on a community level. Simply put, the Climate Fairplay podcast addresses the urgency of climate change and connects it to real-world experiences. The podcast aims to make climate and environmental issues relevant and actionable for listeners. It's made for those who understand that right now is a critical time to act on climate change and want to push climate progress further. This podcast keeps you informed on climate and environmental news, science, and politics, without the need to read every peer-reviewed journal or senseless news article, because who has the time for that? The goal is to make it easy to learn about environmental solutions by engaging people on digital platforms where ideas are shared and conversations are happening. I crave more media that addresses climate solutions like a real person would, and that's what each episode is designed to do. Each episode focuses on one environmental topic or issue and is broken up into segments, beginning with an introduction of the main topic with background information and key points. We break and come back with an interesting fact or statistic related to the episode's focus that's worthy of sharing with your friends during your morning coffee, or maybe just to impress your dog during your evening walk. We'll return with our rotating series of segments, like a listener Q&A, a segment that addresses flawed policies, greenwashing, and current environmental debates, or focus our attention on the positive news, science breakthroughs, and environmental wins. We'll always end with actionable steps listeners can take related to the episode's topic. In addition to this, The podcast is creating environmental discussions on places like Instagram, Threads, and Reddit. You can find the podcast on social media with the handle Climate Fairplay. No spaces. Check out the show notes for links and to sign up for the mailing list. Now, I'd like to introduce myself in more detail. My name is Cody Sanford. I'm the host and creator of this podcast. I'm an independent environmental journalist and trained ecologist specializing in climate policy, community-level sustainability, and mountain ecology. I earned a Bachelor of Science from Colorado State University, focusing my degree on environmental and sustainability sciences. I have a passion for environmental communication. I think nature is one of the few things that can connect people, regardless of culture, religion, or politics, as shown in how almost every nation signed the Paris Agreement. And I think we need to utilize that love and connection to nature if we want to push climate progress further. This is one of the 2 podcasts I'm a part of. I host the Livable Future podcast with a great environmental researcher and friend, Katie Barker. In the Livable Future podcast, Katie and I interview environmental scientists and activists that we gain inspiration from. We focus on global sustainability and feature guests from around the world. If you're looking for more environmental podcasts, I suggest you check out this series, also linked in the show notes. I'm also an avid outdoor enthusiast. I spend a lot of my time in the mountains of Colorado. I'm an amateur nature photographer, and I love getting out in nature as much as possible. I can be called a huge nerd when it comes to environmental policy. I stay up to date with the current news, and I'm fascinated by how politics intersect with climate progress. I also listen to a lot of podcasts. I think this is a fantastic medium to learn and to discuss ideas that don't get adequate attention in traditional or social media. I think that's a decent summary of who I am. If you have any questions, please reach out on social media or via email. Now it's time to shift to our first shareable stat break. And after the break, we are going to discuss the paradox of the US having the most climate funding in its history while reaching record high carbon emissions in 2023. I'll be candid about my dismay on environmentalism and the current process of climate action, which, as I've said earlier, often feels like it's a performative act. A 2024 study in Nature Communications found that between 66 and 80% of Americans support climate action. This fact might have been surprising to you, since the study found that most people believe support falls around 40% for climate policies. So you're not as alone in your climate concerns as you might think. The Pew Research Center found similar results. Nearly 3/4 of Americans favor U.S. participation in international climate negotiations, and 2/3 believe the U.S. federal government should promote wind and solar energy. But the data becomes more complicated when we look at what the public believes is causing climate change. Only 42% of people understand human activity, like burning fossil fuels, causes climate change, despite more than 97% of climate scientists agreeing on this. That's according to 2023 Pew Research. This highlights why support for specific climate policies varies widely. For example, some people say they support climate action, but oppose reducing our dependence on fossil fuels. Support for climate action splits along political lines. While 90% of Democrats prioritize renewable energy, only 42% of Republicans agree. Overall, 54% of Americans see climate change as a major threat. I think it's worth mentioning that environmental policy used to be bipartisan. Political divides have obviously grown, and that's a topic we can get into another time. Still, I'm hopeful there's bipartisan support for some climate-forward policies, like funding renewable energy. To me, these insights reveal that, while there are partisan divides, there is still more support for climate action in the United States than I originally thought. But the fact is, we also need to do a better job of talking with people about what's causing climate change. Only 42% of people understand humans are creating the problem, which is an underlying cause of why climate progress is falling behind. I think bringing up these connections can create important conversations about climate progress and highlight the common ground that is needed for climate solutions. I've made infographics summarizing these points, which are available to share on social media. You can find them with the handle Climate Fairplay, no spaces. Since this is the first episode, I want to call attention to the overarching attitudes and societal barriers that I see greenwashing climate action and preventing the measures that would achieve a sustainable future. And more importantly, I want to start a discussion on how we fix these obstacles. Let's remember climate progress is happening at an accelerated pace. There's the most climate forward policies and the most funding for climate adaptations ever. The concept of net zero emissions was a fringe idea, not really in the global conversation, until the Paris Agreement was reached in 2016. Now, all major polluting countries have net zero targets, along with thousands of cities around the world. The Paris Agreement is the largest global accomplishment, in which almost every country has agreed to limit global warming to 2 degrees Celsius and pursue efforts to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Within the last 8 years in the United States, there have been stronger environmental policies at pretty much every level. There's billions of funding going towards a sustainable society, thanks to the Inflation Reduction Act. This is the largest investment in renewable energy, with $369 billion. It provides funding to reduce methane emissions and to expand green manufacturing in the United States. It builds climate-resilient infrastructure to protect against extreme weather and sea level rise. There's funding to lower our carbon footprints in our homes, schools, and public buildings, including tax credits for solar panels, electric vehicles, and energy efficient appliances. This overall is an exciting time for people who care about climate progress. Despite unmet goals, momentum is accelerating. Yet, there's a strong disconnect between climate progress and the reality of a person's lived experience. When I talk to people, even those who care about climate change, they often have no idea about these climate policies, let alone how it will affect their own community. This disconnect with a person's lived experience, I believe, is caused by overarching actions, attitudes, and societal barriers that are numbing people from a genuine connection to environmental issues. I think these barriers need our attention if we want to reach our climate goals. In 2023, the US had the highest greenhouse gas pollution ever, and we are 7 short years away from the goal of 40% carbon reductions. For the rest of the episode, we are calling attention to these disadvantages and beginning the discussion on how to fix the roadblocks preventing the average person from participating in meaningful climate progress. An obvious sign of the disconnect is how many communities don't really have an opportunity for a regular person to adopt sustainable practices. While governments are slow to fund their climate targets, on a local level, many cities struggle with funding public transportation and lack access to renewable energy. By 2030, public transport capacity must double and infrastructure growth needs to be 6 times faster to meet the 1.5 degree warming target. Around 25% of US counties have restrictions on wind and solar or battery storage development, which puts limits on how beneficial renewable energy can be. We can't expect sustainable practices to be widespread if they don't actually exist for the vast majority of people. We need more attention towards implementing renewable energy, sustainable transportation, and food systems that actually work for a regular person. Too often, discussions about the slow growth of climate progress focus on an individual's inability to adopt greener habits, rather than looking at what infrastructure is there to support this transition. On a similar note, every time an individual person's impact is mentioned, I think we need to shift attention to the corporations and industries responsible for the majority of greenhouse gas pollution. Research shows just 100 companies have been the source of more than 70% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions since 1988. To me, the lack of sustainable options and disingenuous nitpicking of what one person is doing when there are such heavy polluters not being held accountable makes the process easy for people to disengage and tune out. I think the lack of pressure on the large polluters furthers the feeling of climate progress being out of touch with the urgency that's needed to prevent the worst of the climate crisis. I think we need to do a better job of pressuring our politicians and business leaders to fund and implement green energy and sustainable transportation and sustainable food systems. But unfortunately, research shows trust in government and business to address climate change is low, with 56% of people globally saying that their government leaders are purposely trying to mislead people by saying things they know are false or gross exaggerations. If you pay attention to climate politics, it's clear politicians speak from both ends when it comes to the climate, and I've definitely noticed anti-climate politicians successfully misleading people. Sadly, when people hear these misleading claims, it skews their understanding on how scientists actually agree on the cause of climate change. Studies show that when people are exposed to misinformation, they're less likely to believe that a consensus exists among scientists, which is a common tactic among anti-climate politicians. If people don't believe scientists are in agreement, trust in the whole process is eroded. This disconnect leads to the perception that climate initiatives lack credibility. When an actual beneficial policy is implemented, a subset of the population will always view it as worthless because they're misled about the climate crisis by their leaders. I think climate action feeling disconnected also comes from climate-friendly politicians. We've all heard the big bold speeches from insert whichever liberal politician about their dedication to tackling climate change, but when it comes to actual policy, we can expect the government to expand the oil and gas industry, like what happened in the Biden administration. America has topped Russia, Saudi Arabia, and all other countries in crude oil production for the last 6 years. Don't get me wrong, Biden is the much better president when it comes to climate progress. Biden has achieved the most climate progress, but expanding oil production contradicts the urgent need to reduce fossil fuel dependence and mitigate climate change. I've heard John Kerry, the former climate envoy, defend the expansion of oil and gas in the US while negotiating a net zero carbon future at international negotiations. This disconnect between what leaders say versus the reality, I think it undermines trust. After reading the study that shows 56% of people feel similar, I realized that this sentiment is more widespread and adds to the systematic greenwashing of climate action. It feels like politicians on both sides view climate change as a performative act used to score political points with their target base. This leads to another issue. I found there's often a generalization in people's mind in what climate action means. The headline-grabbing news of a climate protester throwing paint at another landmark is a better news story on social media than the huge wins with investments in clean energy, transportation, and climate-resilient infrastructure that's currently happening. The media paints young people who care about the planet as villains and provides a reason for people to discredit the message. The media's lack of focus distorts the conversation from the real issues, making it harder for people to see the efforts and successes in climate action. This generalization also shows in how the media emphasizes extreme weather events and sensational news stories over ongoing climate action efforts. A recent study found that although climate change is mentioned more when we discuss extreme weather, coverage remains heavily skewed towards dramatic events rather than climate initiatives. To give credit where it is due, media framing now highlights the economic benefits of climate policies and the immediate risks posed by climate change. And guess what? That has shown to boost public support for climate initiatives. However, sensational news stories still overshadow substantive reports, and there are real solutions to discuss. I mean, at least these stories overall are attempts to bring a conversation focused on climate change, compared to the greenwashing campaigns that flood the media. Greenwashing is where companies and politicians show misleading environmental goals or plans without making significant changes. Greenwashing appears in advertisements, press releases, news stories, and in social media campaigns. This paints a false picture of commitment, while real impactful actions remain minimal. A 2020 study found that two-thirds of consumer behavior is influenced by greenwashing, indicating it's having a larger impact on us than we probably think. Performative climate actions by corporations aimed at maintaining a positive public image, I think, overshadows the essential changes required to address the environmental crisis. I've heard so many ads from Shell and BP Oil, for example, claiming now to be leaders in sustainability efforts. This phenomenon, especially by the oil industry, not only misleads consumers, but hinders the overall progress towards building a sustainable future. Climate progress requires transparency, accountability, and actual commitments from corporations and governments. It requires shifting our energy away from the oil and gas industry. The superficial atmosphere around climate media has caused this distrust when I hear climate action or sustainable practices, because it's often a protester being made to look like a villain, or a 30-second news story claiming we are now doomed, when climate scientists are basically shouting the solution, or worse, some corporation spouting their latest greenwashing lies. All this combined undermines genuine climate progress, leaving an impression of climate action as performative. Plus, it leaves little room in the media for the real efforts needed to address the climate crisis. In regards to the climate conversation, I think we've all noticed the overarching discourse is highly negative. There's a difference between being a realist and being a defeatist. This defeatist attitude I've seen both online and in person among people who have a lot to say but have probably put forward very little effort. Many people believe it's too late to do anything, and this mindset is incredibly damaging and likely part of the goal of those spreading misinformation. Research shows that oppositional media has shifted from outright climate change denial to delay tactics, which can be just as harmful in preventing effective climate policies. The public response to climate change is often muted due to emotions like apathy, helplessness, and pessimism. These emotions are normalized through societal norms like the lack of green infrastructure in a community, leading to a pervasive lack of action. It's like people don't try to care because they don't think anything they do matters. This is exactly what those delay tactics aim to achieve. People deny responsibility for individual climate change by morally disengaging. This reinforces the belief that personal efforts won't make a difference, or there's nothing more to give besides maybe voting once a year. This couldn't be further from the truth. We are making major strides and the potential for more change is immense. We have to push harder and stay committed. By focusing on successes and the tangible ways we can build a sustainable future, we can transform the current narrative of paralysis and fear to one of hope and proactive effort. It's true that the majority of pollution comes from large corporations, but change will happen when we collectively demand accountability and adopt sustainable practices. We can't let the negativity overshadow progress. I think environmentalists need to break free from this sort of learned helplessness and begin celebrating the victories, no matter how small, while continuously pushing for more. Sure, it feels like we're up against a mountain, but once you realize the power we all hold to make a difference, the climate crisis transforms into a series of small battles, rather than an overwhelming struggle. We've covered a lot in this episode. I want to quickly summarize the points that I believe are foundations for actually connecting climate progress to people on a local level. Access to clear information on climate progress is a great starting point. In the media, we need more straightforward conversations that cut through the noise and get to the heart of the issue. And that's what this podcast aims to do. When we start seeing how these climate policies impact our daily lives, it becomes less about abstract ideas and more about real change. We need faster implementation of solutions that reduce carbon emissions on a community level. Prioritizing renewable energy, sustainable transportation, and food systems are critical areas that our local governments should have plans to support. To be honest, I'm not sure what to do about the systematic greenwashing, besides, I guess, calling it out when we see it and doing our best to be on the lookout for it. My advice is when a corporation makes a claim to be climate forward, look to see if it's verifiable, and never trust an oil company to be a climate leader. On a personal level, I think having conversations that connect the urgency of acting right now on climate change, along with the solutions that are available with more people in the community, is a good starting point that could counterbalance some of the superficial climate media that is persistently greenwashing the climate discussions. I think one of the most critical attitude shifts we can have is looking at climate progress as a series of small steps rather than one impossible mission. Just as important, I think we need to remember how influential collective organizing is. Having a unified voice on a local level is one of the fastest ways to bring a solution, and I think it's one of the most powerful tools people who care about climate progress have. Starting in our communities can create real change and affect broader policies. Now, these are barriers that I see in my own life and community, but I'm sure it's far from a comprehensive list. I'd like to know what barriers you see are preventing you or your community from choosing a sustainable, climate-forward option. What do you think is most critical to creating climate progress in your community? What motivates you to take action on climate solutions? We'll continue this discussion on Threads, Reddit, and Instagram, and it'd be better if you join us. The mission of the podcast is to empower listeners with knowledge and actionable steps you can take to gain a sense of empowerment. This is pretty much what this series is all about, exploring the connection between people's everyday lives, climate action, and environmental science. Each episode is dedicated to one climate or environmental issue, connecting it with the tangible ways we can build a sustainable society. The majority of people are ready for climate action, but the true shift will happen when more people like you and me start bringing climate solutions to our own lives and communities, and that connection can begin through weekly podcast episodes. I guess now is the time I'll ask you to take a moment and subscribe to the Climate Fairplay podcast. I'll be releasing new episodes of this series every other week. Listening, you'll stay informed and understand how to take actionable steps in your daily life. You'll hopefully gain a deeper understanding of climate and environmental science. We'll address flawed policies, greenwashing, current environmental debates, and spotlight environmental victories, all as we connect environmental policy and climate action to a community level. New episodes are released every other Monday, and your support by subscribing and sharing can help make this series a sustainable venture. Now, with all that said, I want to thank you for listening to the podcast. I appreciate every listen because it takes a lot of work, resources, and heart to make this possible. If you'd like to continue this discussion, join us on social media. I'd love to hear your thoughts. In the next episode, we'll jump into the current state of global climate action. Spoiler alert, we are doing so poorly at keeping our climate goals. When I say we, I mean every nation who signed the Paris Agreement is not meeting targets. I want to answer the question, why are climate commitments so off target? And what can we do about it? If you have any environmental or climate-related questions that need a deeper answer than just what Google or AI can provide, I'd love to incorporate them in our listener Q&A segment. This part of the episode is dedicated to discussing the real issues people face when trying to incorporate sustainable practices. So please reach out with your questions via the email address in the show notes or through the website portal. Thanks again for listening.